In April of 1984, a rich man bought the land beside an old farmer, then laughed at the only warning that could have saved him. The next spring, the field he had paid more than $1 million for began to move in the dark, and by then nobody in Miller County was laughing anymore. The sale closed on a Thursday morning at the Miller County Courthouse in Tuscumbia, Missouri, in a second-floor room that smelled of floor wax, damp wool, and old paper. Rain had come through before dawn and left the square shining under a low gray sky. Pickup trucks sat nose out along the curb. A courthouse clock ticked above the recorder's desk, and Royce Calloway stood there in a Navy sport coat, signing his name the way a man signs when he has never once doubted that land would move out of his way. The Aldrich place was 640 acres of river-bottom soil, rolling pasture and neglected timber running along the east bend of the Osage River. It had belonged to the Aldrich family for 91 years until the last son died in a nursing home in Jefferson City, and the nieces decided without much sadness that none of them wanted mud taxes or fence repairs. The auction had drawn half the county. Men came in clean hats and dirty boots talking about corn prices, interest rates, and whether anyone had the nerve to bid on that much ground with the river running so close. Royce Calloway had nerve. Royce had money. And more than either of those, Royce had a way of standing in a room that made other men feel they were already a step behind him. He owned Calloway Grain and Storage, 3 elevators between Eldon and Versailles, a feed warehouse near the highway, and a cold storage building leased to a meat packer out of Sedalia. He was 48 years old, broad in the shoulders with silver just starting to show at his temples, and a smooth face that looked better under fluorescent light than it ever did in sunshine. His black Lincoln town car sat outside the courthouse with the engine idling. Behind it waited 2 white Chevrolet pickups with Calloway Grain and Storage painted on the doors in dark green letters. When the recorder slid the deed across the counter, Royce's lawyer tapped the corner of the page with one finger. 640 acres, the lawyer said, as though the land might not understand its own size. All closing costs settled. No liens remaining except the development note. Royce signed. The pen moved fast. Across the hall near the wide window that looked down toward the square, an old man watched without speaking. Nobody had invited him. Nobody had needed to. Wendell Stroud's farm touched the Aldrich place for nearly 3/4 of a mile along a crooked fence line that had outlived 4 owners, 2 floods, and 1 lawsuit over stray cattle back in 1938. He had come to the courthouse that morning to renew a county culvert permit and pay the property tax on his own 118 acres. He wore a brown canvas coat gone dark at the cuffs, denim overalls, and boots whose soles had been patched more than once. His white hair had been combed straight back with water, though the rain had already undone most of the effort. He was 73 years old and looked like a man built almost entirely of wire bone and habit. Most people in Miller County knew Wendell Stroud. Not many knew him well. They knew he had lived alone on the Stroud place since his wife Maybelle died in 1979. They knew his barn leaned toward the river and that his hay binder broke down every June, and that he drove a faded blue 1966 Ford F-100 with a cracked windshield and a toolbox chained in the bed. They knew he kept 43 head of mixed cattle, planted a little bottom corn baled his own hay, and never bought anything new if a bolt of file or a length of baling wire could make the old thing work one more season. They also knew he had strange ideas about land. Wendell did not farm by the calendar alone. He watched where the fog settled in the low places before sunrise. He marked rain on a chart nailed to his kitchen wall. He noticed when cattle refused a gate, when crawdads built their mud chimneys too far from water, when fence posts leaned without any wind to lean them. He kept his notes in pencil, and he had done it so long that the men at the Tuscumbia Cafe called it Stroud weather magic whenever they wanted something to laugh at. Royce saw him by the window and smiled the way a rich man smiles at a poor old one when there are witnesses in the room. Mr. Stroud, Royce said, "Looks like we are neighbors now." Wendell nodded once. "Looks like it." Royce folded the signing papers into a leather folio. "I imagine you will be glad to see that old Aldrich ground cleaned up. Place has been underused 20 years. It has been left alone for a reason," Wendell said. The lawyer looked up. Royce's smile held where it was, but something behind it cooled by a few degrees. A reason. Wendell stepped away from the window. He did not raise his voice. That was one of the things people had always mistaken for weakness. He almost never raised his voice, not when a bull broke through wire, not when the starter on the Ford died on him in February. "There is a north hedge," he said. "Osage, orange, cedar, wild plum. Runs above the old creek scar. Do not cut it." Royce waited as if the rest of a joke were coming. "And do not fill the dead creek," Wendell added. The lawyer glanced at Royce, then back at the old man. Royce gave a small laugh. "Dead creek. That is what folks call it now. It is not dead." Mr. Stroud, Royce said with more patience than kindness, "I just bought 640 acres. I have engineers coming in from Columbia, drainage men from Boone County, a soil plan, a bank plan, a planting schedule, and 2 center pivots already priced out. I promise you, we will know where the water is." Wendell looked at him for a long second. "No," he said. "You will know where it is standing. That is not the same thing." The room went quiet in the uncomfortable way rooms do when an old man says something nobody wants to answer. Royce closed the folio. "Well," he said, "I did not pay $1 million to farm around ghost stories." The lawyer chuckled first. Then the recorder's assistant, not loud, just enough to make clear which man in the room mattered more. Royce turned toward the stairs. His boots were too polished for the weather. Wendell stayed where he was. Through the courthouse glass, he could see the wet square, the Lincoln waiting, and beyond the buildings past the feed store, and the church steeple, the low invisible stretch of land where the Aldrich place came to meet his own. The laughter behind him meant nothing. He had heard that same laughter for 40 years. What stayed with him was the cold he had felt cross Royce's face for 1/2 second at the word reason. A man who laughed easy and cooled fast was a man who would not stop until the ground itself stopped him. He stood there longer than he meant to. An old clerk he had known since grade school, a man named Otho Bell, who stamped permits with the slow care of someone who had outlived his own usefulness and knew it, slid Wendell's culvert paper across the counter and did not quite meet his eye. "You want to be careful with that one," Otho said quietly, nodding at the empty stairwell where Royce had gone. "He bought half the loan paper in this county before he bought the Aldrich place. Men owe him. Men who used to owe the bank now owe him instead, and they will laugh at whatever he wants them to laugh at." "I know it," Wendell said. Otho looked at him then, and there was something old and tired in it. "My daddy used to say your daddy could stand at the river and tell you 3 days out whether it meant to come up over the road." Folks laughed at Otis Stroud too, right up until the year they did not. Wendell took the stamped paper and folded it into his coat. "They always do," he said. "The trouble is the year they stop laughing is the year somebody loses everything they own." He went down the stairs slow, one hand on the rail the way a man comes downstairs when his knees have carried him through 73 winters. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist that hung in the square without falling, and the Lincoln was already gone. That night, the telephone rang while the supper dishes still soaked in the sink. It was Glenn. Wendell knew before he lifted the receiver. His son called on Sunday evenings, regular as a clock, from a brick house in Kansas City with central heat and a wife named Diane and 2 children Wendell saw twice a year. This was a Thursday. A Thursday call from Glenn meant the boy had heard something. Dad Glenn said, Harold Dunbar's wife told Diane the Aldrich place sold to Calloway, the grain man. It did. There was a pause shaped like the 400 miles between them. You know what that ground is worth now, with somebody like that beside you. Calloway will pay real money for those 118 acres. Real money, Dad. You could come up here. We have got the room. You are 73 years old, fixing a binder that broke down when Eisenhower was president. Wendell looked through the kitchen window at the dark line of the hedge across the fence, just visible against the last gray of the sky. I am not selling, he said. Glenn's breath came hard down the line. He had his mother's temper and none of her patience for letting it cool. You always say that. You said it when Mom was sick and you would not move her closer to the hospital in Jeff City. You say it about the truck, about the barn, about everything. You would rather sit out there talking to coos and reading Grandpa's old book than spend one Christmas in a house with people in it. The words landed in a soft place Wendell did not let many men reach. He held the receiver and said nothing because Maybelle had taught him long ago that not every wound needed an answer, and because some part of him, the part he did not speak about, even to himself, wondered if the boy was right. He did live with the dead. He read a notebook a man had filled out before the First World War, and he trusted it over engineers from Columbia. Maybe that was wisdom. Maybe it was just an old man choosing the company of ghosts over the company of his own son. I read the book, Wendell said finally, because the men who wrote it were right when nobody believed them. That is the only reason. You sound like you are talking about yourself, Glenn said, and then quieter. I did not mean it that way. I know what you meant. They said the small things people say to climb down off an argument, and Glenn hung up. Wendell stood a long while with his hand still on the phone, listening to the house tick and settle around him, the way an old house breathes after dark. Then he washed the last two plates, dried them, and put them where Maybelle had always kept them. By noon the next day, the news had reached the Tuscumbia Cafe. The way news in a small town always reaches the cafe, carried like a match through dry grass. The cafe sat 2 blocks off the square between a farm insurance office and a barber shop with a red pole that no longer turned. It had 6 booths, 10 counter stools, and a pie case near the register that held coconut cream, chocolate meringue, and whatever fruit Loretta Banks had been handed by somebody's aunt that week. The place smelled of bacon grease, coffee, and the faint metal scent of wet coats steaming by the door. Royce Calloway came in at 12:20 with his lawyer, his field manager, and a banker named Garrett Pruitt from Farmers and Merchants. By then, half the county already knew the Aldrich deed had closed. 3 farmers moved their hats off the counter when Royce walked in. Loretta poured him coffee without being asked. So said Harold Dunbar, who ran cattle west of town and loved a rich man's plans as long as they stayed off his own land. You really going to flatten that Aldrich jungle? Royce took his time stirring cream into the cup. Not all of it, he said. Only the parts God forgot to finish. The men laughed. Wendell was not there yet. Royce leaned back on the stool. We clear the north hedge first, then the old wash laser level. The lower 200 acres tile, the wet pockets bring in irrigation and plant corn, where the Aldriches grew brush and excuses. About time, said a man from the back booth. That ground ought to produce. It will, Royce said, if people let it. Pruitt the banker smiled into his cup. Development note looks strong. Land like that properly improved carries itself by the second season. Then Loretta, who rarely meant any harm, but often carried news anyway, said it. Wendell Stroud told him not to cut the hedge. That did it. A soft chuckle moved down the counter. Harold Dunbar turned halfway around. Stroud say why, spirits in it. Royce raised both hands in surrender. I was warned about a dead creek that apparently is not dead. Another laugh. Water has got a memory, did you not hear? Said Cleve Hartman, a seed dealer who wore his cap even in church basements. Stroud can hear it talking through a fence post. "Now hold on," Loretta said, though she was smiling too. "Stroud knows that bottom better than most." "Stroud knows," 1940, Cleve said. "That is the problem." The door opened then, and the little bell above it gave a tired ring. Wendell stepped inside. The room did not go silent all at once. It thinned. One conversation stopped, then another. A spoon clicked against a saucer. Someone coughed into his fist. Wendell took off his hat, shook the rain from the brim, and walked to the counter as though he had heard none of it, though every man there knew he had. Loretta reached for a cup. "Coffee, Wendell." "Please." Royce turned on his stool, still smiling. "Mr. Stroud, we were just discussing agricultural philosophy." "So I heard." Cleve Hartman leaned in with the confidence of a man surrounded by people who would laugh if he did. "Tell us again about that creek that is not a creek." Wendell wrapped both hands around the coffee. His fingers were long-knuckled, scarred by wire and old machinery. He looked down at the black surface of the cup before he answered. "A creek is just a word for water you can see." A few men grinned. Royce sighed theatrical enough for the whole counter to catch. "Wendell, I respect tradition. I truly do. But tradition does not pay 12% interest. That place needs drainage. It needs straight rows. It needs modern work. The hedge is in the way." "So is a bridge," Wendell said. "Until you need one. That line should have ended it. In another room with different men it might have." But Royce Calloway had not paid $1,270,000 to be corrected by a widower in patched boots. He set the cup down. "Let me ask you something. If that hedge and that old wash are so valuable, why did the Aldriches never get rich off them?" A harder laugh this time, not loud but sharper. Wendell took a slow breath. "Because some things do not make you rich. They keep you from losing what you already have." Cleve Hartman shook his head. "That sounds real pretty." The banker checked his watch. Royce stood, laid $2 on the counter for coffee he had barely touched, and looked around the room just enough to be sure everyone was still with him. "Gentlemen," he said, "in 6 months that ground will look like a farm instead of a superstition." Then he turned to Wendell. "And when the first crop comes in, you are welcome to stand at the fence and tell me the water disapproves." He left the cafe smiling. This time the laughter waited until the door closed, which in a town like Tuscumbia counted as politeness. Wendell stayed on his stool. Loretta topped off the cup he had not asked her to fill. Her face had gone red, maybe from the grill, maybe from something else. "You know how they are," she said quietly. "I do," Wendell said. Outside, the Lincoln pulled from the curb, followed by the 2 white pickups, their tires hissing through the wet street, heading toward the river road. In the back booth, Harold Dunbar was still going. "Old Stroud has been waiting on another 27 his whole life. Maybe he will finally get one." "Give him something to write down," Cleve said. Wendell laid $1 beside his cup and left before the coffee cooled. The drive home took 11 minutes when the road was dry and 15 when it was not. That day, Wendell took 20. He drove slowly along County Road 18 past the church cemetery where Maybelle lay under a stone he had paid for in 3 installments, past the closed one-room schoolhouse, past a rusted Alice Chalmers tractor sitting in a field where no one had moved it since Carter was president. The wipers dragged across the glass with a dry rubber squeak, though the rain had nearly quit. At the top of the last rise, he pulled onto the shoulder and looked down. There was the Aldrich place. Even in April, before the leaves filled in, the land looked generous. Broad open bottom near the river, a gentle lift toward the north. Dark soil in the low spots, the kind of ground that made bankers speak softly and seed dealers stand up straighter. But Wendell did not look at the open field first. He looked at the hedge. It ran crooked across the north edge, darker than the ground behind it. A tangled strip of thorned osage orange cedar plum, elderberry, and old wire long since swallowed by bark. Beyond it lay the shallow depression people called the Dead Creek, a pale scar through the grass and weeds that seemed to begin nowhere and end in nothing. Royce Calloway saw wasted acres there. Wendell Stroud saw a pressure line, the place where the land let its weight down easy instead of all at once. He drove the rest of the way home. The Stroud place sat behind a sagging gate with one hinge replaced by a length of chain. The farmhouse had been white once and was gray now, with a tin roof that flashed dull under the clouds. A walnut tree stood in the side yard. The barn leaned east as if it were listening to the river. Behind it, the lower pasture ran down toward the fence line, damp, but not yet wet enough to worry most men. Wendell parked beside the back porch and sat a moment with both hands still on the wheel. Maybelle used to say he carried a storm in his shoulders 3 days before it arrived. He could almost hear her now, standing in the kitchen doorway, telling him to either come in or quit letting the heat out. But Mabel had been gone 5 years, and the house was quiet when he stepped inside. He hung his coat on the nail by the door, washed his hands at the sink, and stood looking through the window toward the Aldrich land. Then he opened the second drawer beneath the flour bin. The notebook lay wrapped in oilcloth. Its cover was dark brown leather, cracked at the corners, swollen slightly from decades of damp weather and kitchen air. Silas Stroud had written his name inside it in 1916, the same year he bought the first 80 acres of the Stroud place with mule money, timber money, and his wife's egg savings. The pages were filled with pencil notes, rain marks, hand-drawn maps, flood heights, cattle losses, repairs, arguments with neighbors, and warnings set down by a man who believed memory was a tool, sharp only if you kept it sharp. Wendell set the notebook on the kitchen table and opened it carefully. He did not need the index. He knew where to look. June 3rd, 1927. The handwriting leaned slightly right, tight and even. River rose after warm rain. Aldrich North Field took water from below. Before the ditch ever filled, North Hedge held, Aldrich Field did not. Blue clay opened near the mule run. Never cut the hedge. Never fill the old creek. Water remembers the road even when men forget it. He read the line twice. Here was the thing the men at the cafe could never understand, the thing his own son could not understand from a brick house in Kansas City. The warning was not a feeling. It was not a smell on the wind or a witch's tale. It was a record. Beneath the Aldrich bottom ran a vein of blue clay, dense and slick, that water could not soak through. Rain fell on the high ground for miles, sank until it struck that clay, and then traveled sideways underground, the way water always travels when it cannot go down. For 1,000 years it had found the low scar of the dead creek and risen there, gently spreading out, doing no harm. The North Hedge held that ground together with 100 years of root. The old relief channel, the one Silas had drawn in pencil, carried the overflow east and away. Cut the hedge and the bank that held the pressure lost its grip. Fill the creek and the water that had always risen slow would have nowhere to go but up fast and out, taking the easiest road it could find. And the easiest road, once the old one was buried, ran straight through the Stroud lower pasture. That was the whole of it. Wendell understood it the way he understood his own hands, and he knew he would never make Royce Calloway understand it at all, because a man who has just paid $1 million cannot afford to believe that he has bought a mistake. He sat with the lamp burning and let himself remember the last time he had seen the stones open, because remembering was the only company the kitchen offered him anymore. He had been 40 years old in the spring of 1951, and his father, Otis, was 68 and already going gray around the lungs from a lifetime of dust. The river had come up after a warm rain just the way the notebook said it would, and Otis had woken him at 2 in the morning with a lantern in one hand and a pry bar in the other, and a look on his face that left no room for argument. They had driven the same Ford down the same road, and they had knelt at the mule crossing in the dark, and Otis had set Wendell's young hands on the cold iron and shown him where the cedar plug went, and how to feel for the stone lip beneath the mud, and how to lean so the bar did the work instead of the back. "You will do this without me." Someday, Otis had said, the water already pulling at their boots. "And there will be men telling you it is foolishness. There always are." He had spat into the dark. "A man who has never lost a field thinks every field is safe. You remember that. The river does not care how sure he sounds." Wendell had not understood it fully at 40. He understood it now. His father had been dead since 1958, buried beside Maybell's eventual place in the church cemetery on the rise, and the only living thing that still carried what Otis knew was an old man at a kitchen table and a leather book that everyone but him called a joke. He reached for the pencil beside the sugar jar and opened his own tablet. April 12, 1984. Calloway bought Aldrich Place. Plans to cut North Hedge and fill Dead Creek. Warned him at courthouse and cafe. Laughed. He paused. From the back porch came the smell of wet earth. Somewhere in the lower pasture, a cow bawled once and went quiet. Wendell added one more sentence. If he cuts it before summer storm season, Stroud Bottom may take the water with him. He closed the tablet, but he did not put the old notebook away. Across the fence, Royce Calloway's men would come soon, with stakes and dozers and straight lines drawn by people who had never once stood knee-deep in that field at midnight, with rain running down the backs of their necks. Wendell looked again at his grandfather's portioning, the pencil gone soft and gray with age. Then he looked out the window toward the dark strip of hedge, holding its place under the low Missouri sky. For now it still stood, and that was the only reason the land was quiet. The next morning, Glenn called again. It was barely past 6 and the radio had not yet clicked on. "I have been thinking," the boy said, "about what I said I should not have brought up Mom." "You were not wrong about her," Wendell said. There was a silence. "I talked to a fella at work whose uncle farms near Vienna. He says when a big operator buys in next to you, the water and the runoff, and all of it becomes your problem too, whether you sell or not. He says you ought to get ahead of it. Document things." "Wendell, are you listening?" "I am listening." "Then for once would you do something about it, instead of writing it down in a book nobody but you will ever read?" The words were meant to help. Wendell knew that. But they cut along the same grain Glenn had cut the night before, the grain that said an old man and his notebook were two useless things kept past their season. He looked at the table where the leather book still lay open to 1927, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of being the only living person who believed what was written there. "I will do something," he said, and he meant it in a way Glenn could not hear. He hung up, and then he did the thing he had not done in years. He took down the brown paper map his grandfather had drawn after the flood of 1928, the one folded so many times the creases had gone white and soft as cloth. Aldrich, North Field, Stroud Lower Pasture, Stone Run, Mule Crossing, Spring Pocket, Relief Ditch. No surveyor would have called it professional. No banker would have trusted it, but every mark on that paper had been put there by a man with wet boots and something to lose, and Wendell folded it into a square and slid it into the inside pocket of his coat, where it would be ready when he needed it, because he was going to need it. He had heard the cold cross Royce Calloway's face at the courthouse. He had watched the Lincoln turn toward the river road. He had read the same warning his grandfather read to his father, and his father read to him, and he knew the way a man knows the ache in his own bad shoulder before the rain, that the warning had not ended at the cafe. It had only just begun. Outside, far off down County Road, 18 faint but unmistakable on the cold morning air, Wendell heard the first sound of diesel. It was not close yet. It was coming. The diesel came over the rise at 6:42 in the morning, and by noon the north hedge had been opened wide enough to drive a combine through. Wendell stood at his own fence and watched the first Osage orange come down. It went over with a dry crack that carried across the cold air like a rifle shot, and 3 crows lifted off the cedar and did not come back. He had thought he was ready for the sound. He was not. His grandfather had set part of that hedge in 1917. His father had refused a government man's money to clear the rest in 1943. Now a yellow dozer with a bright steel blade pushed it into a pile in the time it took Wendell to drink half a thermos of coffee gone cold in his hand. Royce Calloway stood on the low rise beside a man in a white hard hat, pointing across the field the way generals point at maps. Wooden stakes with orange ribbon had already been driven along the dead line of the hedge. Wendell crossed to the wire with the brown paper map in his fist before he had decided to. "Before you start the rest of it," he said, "you ought to see this." Royce did not reach for it. "What is it?" "Drainage map. My grandfather drew it after 27. The hard hat man smiled the way a young man smiles at an old recipe for lantern oil. Royce sighed. "Wendell, I appreciate the concern." "No, you do not." That made the hard hat man look up. Wendell held the paper against the top wire so the wind would not take it. "This line is the channel before it's silted. This is the spring pocket. This run cuts under your hedge and comes out toward my lower hayfield. You plug it, the water comes up behind you." Royce looked at the map for less than 2 seconds. "We had aerials taken." "Aerials do not show what is under the soil." "We had soil tests. Not deep enough." Royce's jaw shifted. "You do not know that." Wendell folded the map. "I know where the cattle will not stand." For a moment, neither man spoke. The dozer idled behind Royce, shaking the morning. Then Royce turned to the operator and lifted one hand, and the blade dropped. But the hard hat man, the field manager whose name was Frank Dolan, lingered a second at the wire after Royce walked off. He was younger than Wendell by 30 years and had the easy contempt of a man who had built things in 4 states and never once been wrong in a way that cost him. "You know what your problem is," old-timer Dolan said. "You think the ground is smarter than the men who measure it." He tapped the orange ribbon on the nearest stake. "We measured it, every foot." Wendell looked at the stake, then at the man. "You measured the top of it," he said. "Nobody ever drowned in the type of anything." Dolan laughed short and went back to his work, and that was the second time in 2 days a stranger had laughed at him, and Wendell found he had stopped counting. The work went on, and Wendell walked back across his own pasture without looking again at the men who were busy turning 100 years of root into a smoking pile by the north corner. He had thought, walking away, that he was ready for the sound of the rest of it coming down. He was not. Each crack of an Osage orange going over carried clear across the cold air, and each one landed somewhere under his ribs because his grandfather had set the first of those trees with a mule and a spade in 1917, and his father had stood between the rest of them in a government man's checkbook in 1943, and now it was all coming down in an afternoon at the word of a man who had owned the land for 6 weeks. He did not go inside. He went to the lower fence and he started writing. That was where the trouble inside the Callaway operation first showed itself, though Wendell did not see it for what it was until later. A car he did not know came up the new gravel that afternoon, a tan Oldsmobile with Jefferson City plates, and a man got out of it in a sport coat too clean for a field. Wendell watched from across the fence the way a man watches weather build in the West. The man was Curtis Lemon. Wendell would learn the name within the week, the way you learn the name of a thing that has begun to cost you. Lemon was Royce's money partner on the development note, 52 years old, soft in the middle, hard, everywhere it counted, and he had not driven down from the capital to admire the river. He had come because the note was tied to planting dates, and planting dates were slipping, and every day the dozers ran was a day the bank charged interest on a field that had not yet grown a single stalk of corn. Wendell could not hear the words. He did not need to. He had watched men argue across hoods of cars his whole life, and the shape of it was always the same. Lemon jabbed a finger at the half-cleared hedge. Royce spread his hands. Lemon jabbed at his own watch. And Royce, who had stood in the courthouse like a man who had never been a step behind anyone, took half a step back from the man in the clean coat. It was the first time Wendell had seen Royce Calloway give ground to anybody. That evening, just before dark, he walked the line where the biggest Osage orange had stood. The air smelled wrong. Not rotten, not yet. Just open the way ground smells when it has been turned far deeper than the plow goes. In the track left by the dozer tread, black water shone. There had been no rain in 11 days. Wendell Crouch touched 2 fingers to it, rubbed them together. Cold. Cellar cold. Not water that had fallen from the sky. He looked toward the Callaway trucks gone now for the night, and then he took out the pocket notebook. April 13th. Water at the north root hole. No rain. Cold seep. Hedge was holding the pressure until they cut it. Behind him a cow bawled. He turned. 3 of his cattle stood at the lower gate staring across the fence at the wounded field. They came to that gate every evening, pushing and crowding, waiting for him to bring hay. Now they would not come within 10 feet of it. The oldest, a red, bald-faced cow named June, that he had raised from a bottle the spring after Maybelle died, stamped once and backed away with her ears pinned. Wendell watched her a long time. Animals did not explain themselves. That was why men ignored them. But June had never been wrong about water, and the look in her was not stubbornness. It was fear. The young man came to him 3 nights later after the crew had gone. Wendell had the porch light on and was greasing the hay rake by its glow when headlights swung up his lane and shut off short of the house. A boy got out, 22 or 3, in a feed cap and a denim jacket gone pale at the elbows. He stood at the edge of the light with his hands jammed in his pockets, like a man who had argued himself into something on the drive over and was now arguing himself back out. "Mr. Stroud," he swallowed. "My name is Travis Holcomb. I run the second dozer for Callaway." Wendell set down the grease gun. "I know your face. You are Del Holcomb's grandson." "Yes, sir." The boy looked at the dark line of the fence as though Royce might be standing in it. "I am not supposed to be here. They would let me go if they knew." He took a breath. "I cut into something today, down where they are filling the wash. Mud. Blue-gray, slick, cold as a well. I called Dolan over the foreman, and he stuck a boot in it and told me it was just old trapped rainwater and to quit standing in it." He laughed. They all laughed. Wendell felt something settle in his chest, heavy and certain. "You did not laugh." "No, sir. I grew up on bottom ground. I know mud that fell out of the sky from mud that came up out of the earth. That mud came up, and it was not in one spot. It ran." He looked at Wendell with the open misery of a young man caught between his paycheck and his gut. "I heard what you told him at the cafe. My grandfather always said you were the only man in this county who could read the river. I just thought somebody besides me ought to know what is under that field." Wendell looked at the boy a long moment. Then he nodded toward the house. "Come inside. I will show you what your great-grandfather's generation already knew about that ground before either of us was born. And I will not laugh." They sat at the kitchen table under the yellow lamp, and Wendell showed him the brown paper map and the place where the run crossed under the gone hedge. And Travis traced it with one blistered finger and went quiet for a long time. If I tell Dolan the boy said, finally he fires me, and he tells every operator from here to Sedalia that I am a kid who spooks at mud. My grandfather left me $40 and a good name when he died. The $40 is gone. He looked up. The name is all I have got to work on. Then do not tell Dolan, Wendell said. Dolan will not hear it from you or from me or from the ground itself until it is screaming. He folded the map. You do not have to throw away your job over an old man's worry. Just keep your eyes open and remember what you saw, so that when the time comes and they all ask how nobody knew, there will be one young man in this county who can say he knew. That is worth more than $40. Travis Holcomb sat with that. Then he stood and shook the old man's hand the way his grandfather must have taught him, firm and brief, and went out to his truck. Wendell watched the headlights swing down the lane and turn onto the road, and for the second time in a week, something in him that had gone tight at the courthouse loosened by a single notch. It was the first time in a long time that anyone had come to him to listen instead of to mock. The reporter came the following Tuesday. Her name was Nora Vance, and she wrote for the Miller County Ledger. 26 years old, sharp-eyed with a steno pad, and the brisk way of a young person who had decided early that the past was mostly nostalgia and the future was where the story was. She had been sent to write up the Calloway River Bottom project, and she came to Wendell only because someone at the cafe, probably Cleve Hartman, had told her there was an old crank next door who thought the water had opinions. She found him repairing a float in the cattle tank. You are the neighbor, she said. They tell me you have some objections. I have a map, Wendell said. He showed her. He spread the brown paper on the tailgate of the Ford and walked her along the lines, the channel, the spring pocket, the run that crossed under the gone hedge toward his hayfield. She listened with her pen still, and Wendell could see her doing the arithmetic young people do, weighing a hand-drawn map from 1928 against $1 million of engineers from Columbia and coming down on the state of the engineers because that was the safe and modern thing to come down on. This is interesting history, she said at last, and the word history landed like a coin dropped on a counter. But the county has signed off on the project. The bank financed it. I cannot run a story that says a 100-year-old Hedge knew more than the soil scientists. I am not asking you to run anything, Wendell said. I am asking you to keep the photographs. She paused at that. The what? Of the map. Of the field the way it is now before the rain. Take your pictures. Put them in a drawer. And when the water comes up, where I am telling you it will come up, you will have them. He folded the map. You do not have to believe an old man. Just do not throw away the proof while it is still cheap. Nora Vance looked at him for a long moment with an expression he could not read. Then she lifted her camera and took 3 pictures of the brown paper and 2 of the smooth-filled wash where the dead creek had been, and she drove away without promising anything. But she had taken the pictures. Wendell had learned long ago that you did not need a man to agree with you. You only needed him to keep the evidence until the evidence spoke for itself. By the first week of May, the Aldrich place no longer looked abandoned. It looked conquered. Royce brought in equipment the way some men bring in an army. A green John Deere 8000 series came off a lowboy trailer from Sedalia, its rear tires standing taller than Wendell's pasture gate. A laser leveler followed, then a drainage crew from Columbia with rolls of black tile stacked like coiled snakes on a flatbed. A new gravel entrance was cut off County Road 18, and beside it stood a sign. Calloway River Bottom Project. High-yield corn development. No trespassing. The men at the cafe admired that sign for 2 full mornings. Looks professional, Harold Dunbar said. Looks like money, said Cleve Hartman. And then on the 9th of May, Royce held what everyone but Royce called a field day. The county extension agent came in a clean county truck, a careful man named Marvin Tilley who had spent 30 years saying nothing that could be quoted against him. Garrett Pruitt came from the bank in pressed khakis. Cleve Hartman brought seed brochures. Two farmers crossed the river just to watch the laser leveler work. Royce stood near the new entrance with a paper cup of coffee, talking slope and yield and efficiency, a man showing other men the future he had bought. Wendell had not meant to stop. He was driving home from the Kiowa with 2 rolls of baling twine and a sack of mineral salt when he saw the crowd. He slowed not because of Royce, but because of the ground. A pale, wet streak had appeared across the newly filled wash, no wider than a wagon track, and it shone under the sun in a way that bare, dry dirt has no business shining. Royce saw the Ford and lifted a hand loud enough for everyone. "Well, Mr. Stroud, come inspect the future." Some of the men turned. Wendell parked on the shoulder and got out slowly. Royce walked toward him with a smile that already had its audience built into it. "Tell me," Royce said, "does this look like a ghost creek to you?" A few men laughed, but it was a thinner laugh than the one at the cafe because some of them had followed his arm and seen the wet streak too. Wendell looked past Royce at the smooth field, the shine, the black tile waiting in coils. "No," he said, "looks like a plugged one." The laughter died in the middle. Marvin Tilley cleared his throat. "Subsurface moisture is not unusual in bottoms, Wendell. Not on a rise, not after 10 dry days." "We have had engineers look at it," Royce said. "Engineers leave before dark." That one landed harder than Wendell had meant it to. He saw it cross Royce's face, that same half-second of cold he had seen at the courthouse, only now there was something underneath the cold that had not been there before. Doubt. And a man like Royce Calloway feared doubt more than he feared bankruptcy, because doubt in front of an audience was a thing he could not buy his way out of. Royce stepped close. "Let me be clear." He kept his voice low, but the field had gone quiet enough that it carried. "This is my land, my investment, my risk. If I want to clear brush, I clear brush. If I want to fill a wash, I fill it. And if you cross that fence again, waving your grandfather's papers, I will call Sheriff Maddox myself and have you hauled off for trespass." It was the first open threat. Wendell looked at the men standing behind Royce, men he had known 40 years, and most of them looked away down at the wet ground or off toward the river, anywhere but at the old man being threatened in front of them. That looking away hurt worse than the threat. A man could stand against an enemy. It was the neighbors who would not meet his eye that wore him down. Only one man did not look away. Harold Dunbar, who ran cattle west of town and had laughed as hard as any of them at the cafe a month before, stood at the edge of the crowd with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the wet streak in the field, and there was no laughter in him now. He did not speak up. He was not that kind of brave. But he looked at Wendell and he gave one small nod, the nod of a man who is beginning to be afraid he picked the wrong side of a thing, and then he too looked at the ground. "All right," Wendell said. It was not the answer Royce wanted. An argument he could have won in front of the crowd. The old man's quiet agreement gave him nothing, and Royce stood there holding a fight that had no one left in it. Wendell got back in the Ford and drove home. But that evening he walked his own lower fence on his own side of the wire where no man could call it trespass, and he found what he had feared. 3 chunks of blue clay, each the size of a thumb, caught in the grass below the line, carried there through a shallow trickle of water that should not have existed at all. He picked one up and broke it open in his hands. Wet clean through, cold as a stone pulled from a cellar floor. He wrote it down. "Calloway Tile is cutting the clay seam, water moving east. Onto my ground now." The land began to give its warnings faster after that, and it gave them in the language Wendell had spent 73 years learning to read. A new brace post on the Calloway North line, set straight on Tuesday, leaned outward by Wednesday. By Friday, 3 more had gone with it, the wire pulling tight at the staples. The gravel road by the half-built machinery shed settled down its center, and the contractor dumped more rock on it and called it compaction. And Wendell stood at his mailbox and watched a loaded truck cross the spot and felt the soft dip of the rear wheels through the soles of his own boots 100 feet away. At the cafe, they were still talking yields. Royce had ordered hybrid seed. The bank had approved the second phase of the note. Cleve Hartman said Calloway would pull 200 bushels an acre once the pivots ran. Somebody asked Wendell whether his cows had predicted the corn price yet. He stirred his coffee and said no, but they still would not stand at the lower gate. And the men laughed, but it was a shorter laugh than it would have been a month before. That afternoon, Wendell went to the county clerk's office with the brown paper map and asked to see the drainage records on the old Aldrich place. The clerk, a tired woman with reading glasses on a chain, brought him a dusty box and told him not to make a mess. He found it near the bottom. Filed August 4th, 1928. A narrow water relief easement crossing the northwest corner of the Aldrich property toward the Stroud Stone Run. Signed by Silas Stroud, Asa Aldrich, and the county judge. County recognized. Legally recorded. 56 years old and still on the books. It was no longer a feeling. It was no longer a notebook. It was law, and Royce Calloway had bulldozed straight across it. Nora Vance found him again 2 days after that, this time without being sent. She caught him at the co-op loading mineral salt, and she did not have her steno pad out, which was its own kind of message. "I have been asking around about Curtis Lemon," she said, keeping her voice low under the rattle of the loading dock. "Did you know he sits on the loan committee at Farmers and Merchants, the same committee that approved the note he is borrowing against?" She watched his face. "You did know." "I figured it," Wendell said. "I did not have the word for it." "The word for it is a conflict," she said. "And it is the kind of word my editor will not let me print without 3 sources and a lawyer, because Lemon gives money to the courthouse and the church and the volunteer fire department." She shifted the camera bag on her shoulder. "So here is where I have landed, Mr. Stroud. I cannot write that the bank is crooked, but I can keep taking pictures. And if that field does what you say it will do, I will have a story that does not need me to call anybody crooked, because the water will have said it for me." Wendell looked at her a long moment. "You came around," he said. "I have not come around to anything," she said quickly, the brisk young certainty snapping back into place. "I just do not like being told what I am allowed to look at. There is a difference." "There is," Wendell agreed, "but it is a smaller difference than you think." She drove off without answering that, and Wendell finished loading the salt, and somewhere up at the Aldrich place, a dozer was running long past the hour men usually quit, because Curtis Lemon was in town, and the note was due, and every day the machines did not run was a day the calendar tightened around Royce Calloway's throat like a wet rope. Wendell paid a quarter for a copy and stepped outside into the sun, and there at the curb was the black Lincoln and Royce standing beside it talking to Garrett Pruitt. Royce saw the paper in his hand and smiled without any warmth in it, still digging. "Somebody has to know where the old things are buried," Wendell said. "You keep looking backward," Royce said. "You will miss what is coming." "No," Wendell said quietly, folding the easement into his coat. "That is exactly how I see it." He drove to the bank on Monday because the easement gave him something he had never had before: a piece of paper a banker was required to read. The Farmers and Merchants building had a brick front, brass door handles, and air conditioning cold enough to turn the sweat sharp under a man's shirt. Garrett Pruitt received him in an office with a framed photograph of his children and a glass ashtray shaped like the state of Missouri. Wendell laid the easement copy on the desk, then the brown paper map beside it. "I am asking you to send somebody out before Calloway lays one more foot of tile." Pruitt adjusted his glasses and did not pick up either paper. Wendell the bank cannot interfere with a borrower's operation because a neighbor has concerns. It is not a concern, it is a recorded easement. The county judge signed it. We will have counsel review it. When it is appropriate, Wendell leaned forward. You financed that shed on a low-rise sitting over a clay seam. When the spring pocket opens, you will not have a machinery shed. You will have sheet metal standing in a hole full of water and a note nobody can pay. And there it was. Pruitt's expression tightened, but not into anger, into something worse, something practiced and smooth. And in that smoothness, Wendell saw the thing he should have seen weeks before. Pruitt was not refusing him out of laziness or even out of loyalty to a good customer. The tan Oldsmobile, the man in the clean coat, the capital plates. The development note that Curtis Lemon backed Wendell said, slowly watching the banker's face. Lemon is in this bank, is he not? A director, a partner. Pruitt's eyes flicked once to the door, and that was the whole answer. You are not financing Calloway. You are financing yourselves, and you cannot send a man out to look at that field because if he writes down what is under it, the note is worthless, and your own people are holding the paper. Pruitt straightened the easement copy and slid it back across the desk. We cannot pause $1 million development over a rain diary, Wendell. There it was again, the laugh. Only this one wore a tie. But Wendell did not pick up the papers right away. He looked at the framed photograph of the banker's children on the desk, two boys in church clothes squinting into a summer sun, and he kept his voice level. You have got a boy about the age I was when my father first took me out to open those stones in the dark, he said. Someday this county is going to be his to live in. When the water comes up the way I am telling you it will, and it takes Hazel Crew's barn, and maybe worse, your boy is going to grow up in a town that knows his father was warned and chose the note over the neighbors. He paused. That is not a threat. I do not make threats. It is just the kind of thing a man cannot buy back later, no matter how good the second season looks. For one moment, something moved behind Garrett Pruitt's smooth face, something that was not practiced and not smooth, and Wendell thought he had reached him. Then the banker looked down at his desk, and the moment closed over like water over a dropped stone. Wendell gathered his papers. At the door, Pruitt softened his voice the way men do when they have won and want to feel kind about it. You have had a hard few years since Maybelle passed. Maybe watching that place change is stirring up old feelings. Wendell stopped with his hand on the brass knob. No, he said, it is stirring up old water. He drove home under a sky that had begun far in the west to stack itself into something. The radio called it a chance of heavy rain over the Memorial Day weekend. Nothing certain, nothing dangerous yet. But Wendell did not like the warmth riding in the wind, the close, wet heat that came too early in the season, and he walked to the back corner of his hayfield in the last light and found water standing where grass should have been dry. A thin skin of it, half an inch deep. It had not fallen, it had risen. He pressed the handle of his shovel into the ground. 6 inches down, the soil gave way soft and hollow under the wood. And for the first time since Royce Calloway signed his name at the courthouse, Wendell felt the fear leave his head and move down into his chest where it sat cold and would not leave. Not fear for Calloway's corn, fear for his own barn, for Hazel Cruz and her lower pasture downstream, for the county road, the culvert, the church cemetery on its little rise, for every place the water would go now that the road it had always taken had been buried under filled dirt and a banker's silence. Glenn's car was in the lane when he came back to the house. Wendell stopped in the yard. His son stood on the porch in city shoes holding a casserole dish Diane had sent, and his face was the careful, ready face of a man who had driven 400 miles to win an argument. I am taking 3 days, Glenn said. I am going to sit down with you and a real lawyer, and we are going to figure out how to get you off this ground before that man's mess becomes your mess." "It already is my mess," Wendell said. "Then sell and walk away from it." Wendell did not answer. He set down the shovel, and he reached into his coat, and instead of the easement, instead of the map, he simply took his son by the sleeve and walked him out past the barn to the back corner of the hayfield, and he stood him in the place where the water had risen in the dark, and he said nothing at all. Glenn looked down. He shifted his weight, and the city shoe sank, and the cold came up around it, and Wendell watched his son's face change in the porch light spilling across the yard. The boy crouched the way Wendell had crouched, the way Silas must have crouched, and he touched the water with 2 fingers and held them up and felt that it was wrong, that it was cold, that it had come from below on a night when no rain had fallen. "How," Glenn said, and his voice had lost all its city certainty. "How is the ground wet? It has not rained." Wendell looked at his son for a long moment under the gathering sky. "Because the man next door buried the only door the water had," he said. "And water does not ask permission. It just finds another way out. Tonight it found my hayfield. The next time it rains hard, it is going to find everything below us." Glenn stood there in the dark with his ruined shoe in his father's words, and for the first time in 20 years he did not argue. He looked out toward the black line where the hedge used to be, and he said quietly, "What do we do?" "We," Wendell thought. "Not you. We." "I am staying," Glenn said. "Whatever it is, I am not leaving you out here alone for this." That night, Wendell set the lantern on the kitchen table and turned the leather notebook to the page he had been avoiding for weeks, the one in his father Otis's hand. The writing, heavier than Silas's, pressed hard into the paper, as if the man had wanted it to last. May 29th, 1943. Warm rain after the river rise. Open the stones before midnight. If the north run is ever blocked, the water will take the barn road. Wendell read it once. Then he read it again, and his hand was not quite steady on the page. Outside, thunder rolled far off beyond the Osage bottoms, low and slow and long, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the dark toward them. And in the morning, when he went out to start the work that might save them, he found that 3 more posts had leaned in the night, and the wet streak in the Calloway field had widened from a wagon track to the width of a road, and standing in the middle of it alone, staring down at the shine on his ruined ground, with the look of a man who has just begun to understand what he has done, was Royce Calloway. By sunset on the 26th of May, the sky over Miller County had turned the color of old brass, and the air had stopped moving entirely, pressing down on the valley thick and warm and wrong. Cattle stood in the pastures with their heads low. The birds had gone silent in the walnut tree beside the house. Even the flies on the porch rail moved slow, as though the whole valley were holding a breath it did not want to let go of. Wendell stood in the barn doorway, with his hand flat against the post where Maybelle had penciled a line during the flood of '51. "Water to here," she had written in the small, careful hand he could still see when he closed his eyes. The line was at his chest. He looked across the fence at the Calloway field, smooth and open, and stripped of everything that had ever broken the wind. Royce's new machinery shed stood square and bright on its gravel pad, and beyond it the cleared bottom ran flat to the river, with nothing left standing to slow a single drop of water. At 7:14, the first hail struck the tin roof. One hard crack, then another. Then the sky came apart. By 8, it was coming sideways. It blew under the porch roof, hammered the barn, filled the ruts, and erased the road. Wendell pulled on the canvas coat that was useless in rain like this, and loaded the Ford by lantern light, working fast, his hands moving on their own. Shovel, axe, pry bar, a coil of rope, the chainsaw, fencing pliers, 2 feed sacks, and the oilcloth bundle that held his grandfather's map. Glenn came out of the house already soaked, stuffing his arms into a borrowed slicker. I am coming. You will ruin those city shoes for good, Wendell said. I already did, Glenn said. Get in. For a heartbeat, Wendell almost told him to stay the way he had told Hazel to stay, the way a father's whole nature is built to keep a son out of the water. Then he looked at the boy's face in the lantern light and saw that there was nothing in it of the man who had wanted to sell the place and walk away, and he understood that telling Glenn to stay behind now would take from him the one thing the storm had given them both. So he did not say it. He handed his son the coil of rope to carry, which was its own way of saying, "Come on then," and Glenn took it without a word, and the two of them went out into the rain together. The radio on the kitchen counter hissed between warnings. Flash flooding possible along the Osage River basin. Possible, Wendell thought, was the word men used right up until the moment they saw it with their own eyes. Then the telephone rang shrill over the storm, and it was Hazel Cruz, 66 years old, and downstream of all of it, her voice shaking under the static. Wendell, water is backing into my lower lot. How high? Past the milk shed steps. He shut his eyes for 1 second. Hazel's place sat below the old creek scar. If the water had already reached her milk shed, then the Calloway field was not draining at all. It was holding. It was filling like a basin, and somewhere under that smooth ground, the pressure was looking for the easiest way out. Stay in the house, he told her. Stay on the high side. We are going out now. The Ford started on the second try. Its headlights bored 2 dull tunnels through the rain as Wendell drove toward County Road 18 with his son white-knuckled in the passenger seat. Water crossed the gravel in brown sheets. Twice the truck slid, and twice Wendell led it steering with the pull instead of against it the way his father had taught him on this same road 40 years before. At the Calloway entrance, the professional sign leaned crooked in the mud, and beyond it men were shouting. Royce had floodlights rigged near the shed, but the rain swallowed half their light. A tractor sat sunk to its axle by the filled wash. 2 pickups had been parked too close to the low ground, their tires buried to the rims in gray muck. The new gravel road had split straight down its center, and water was boiling up through the crack instead of running across the top of it. Royce Calloway stood in a yellow raincoat, soaked black through the shoulders, shouting at his field manager. Cut a trench to the south ditch. We tried, Dolan yelled back. It is pushing back up through the tile. Wendell stepped out of the Ford with the map under his coat. Royce saw him and pointed through the downpour. You need to leave. This is private property. But Wendell was not looking at Royce. He was looking at the field. The ground moved. Not the way water moves, the way a living thing moves under a blanket. A wide section of the smooth corn ground lifted, sank, and then split open with a wet, tearing sound, and mud and black water burst up through the crack as if the earth had been holding its breath all evening and could not hold it 1 second more. One of the workers stumbled backward and went down. Royce turned the color of the sky. What in God's name? The spring pocket, Wendell said. The words were nearly lost in the rain. It opened. Then a shout came from the lower fence, high and ragged. 19 head of cattle, the herd Royce had turned on to the upper pasture to graze until planting had crowded against the wire, trapped between the rising water on one side and the raw-cut bank where the dead creek had been filled on the other. A calf was bawling somewhere in the dark, the sound climbing into a register that turns a man's stomach no matter how old he is. Headlights swung in behind them. Sheriff Earl Maddox arrived in the county truck with 2 volunteer firemen, and behind him came Hazel's nephew, and behind him, his face streaked with mud and rain, Travis Holcomb, who had no reason to be there at all, except that he had cut into that ground with his own machine and could not stay home while it came apart. We have to move water, Maddox shouted, wiping his face. Where? Royce pointed south. "There is a ditch line there." "It will not take it," Wendell said. "How do you know?" Royce snapped. "Because it never did." And then Wendell pulled the easement copy from inside his coat and pushed it into the sheriff's wet hands. "The old relief run crosses here toward my stone run. County recognized. Recorded in 28. We open it now, it pulls the water east before it takes Hazel's barn and the county road in half this herd." Royce stepped between them. "You are not cutting across my field." Wendell looked at him, then the rain running off the brim of his hat, his face still and hard in the white floodlight, and he said the thing he had been holding for 6 weeks. "You bought the field. You did not buy the water." For one moment only the rain answered, and then a third voice cut in sharp and city smooth, even soaked through, and Wendell turned to see Curtis Lemon climbing out of the tan Oldsmobile, hatless, furious. "Nobody is digging anything." He grabbed Royce's arm. "Do you understand what happens if we open that easement in front of the sheriff and a reporter?" He pointed, and there at the edge of the floodlights, camera bag clutched to her chest, stood Nora Vance. "We buried a recorded easement." Lemon hissed. "We do that on camera. The bank is liable. You are liable. I am liable. The note is dead, and so are we. Let the field flood. We file the insurance. We do not admit a thing." Earl Maddox unfolded the soaked paper, squinted at it, and looked up. "This thing is current." "That paper is 56 years old," Lemon said. "So is the river," Wendell said. And then something happened that no one in Miller County would have predicted, least of all Wendell Stroud. Royce Calloway looked at his partner's hand gripping his sleeve, and he looked at the calf screaming in the dark water, and he looked at the old man he had threatened with arrest 2 weeks before, and he pulled his arm free of Curtis Lemon's grip. "There are 19 head of cattle in that water," Royce said, and his voice had gone low and strange. "And a calf. And Hazel Cruz is sitting in her house downstream." He turned to the sheriff. "Open it, whatever it costs me. Open the run." Lemon stared at him. "Royce, the note." "Damn the note," Royce said, and walked away from the man toward the buried mouth of the stone run and did not look back. They followed Wendell across the field in the rain. Royce's crew had covered the old mule crossing with filled dirt and brush, smoothing away the place where his grandfather had written 4 generations of Strouds, had opened the stones by hand. But Wendell knew where the mouth had to be. He had walked it as a boy with his father in the flood of 51. He drove the pry bar down into the mud once. Nothing. Again. Stone. He dropped to one knee and began clawing the mud away with both hands, and Travis Holcomb was beside him before he had pulled the second handful. Then one of the firemen, then Hazel's nephew. 4 men on their knees in the dark, digging into a place a 5th man had paid good money to erase. Royce stood back, breathing hard, watching. There was nothing for his money to do here. There was only the digging. For 10 minutes, nothing gave. They uncovered flat limestone packed clay roots and a board rotted soft as bread, wedged deep in the channel. Water pooled cold around their boots, but would not move. Royce shouted over the storm that it was not working, and Wendell did not answer because answering took breath he needed. He drove the pry bar beneath the cedar plug his father had set and leaned his whole weight onto the iron. His boot slid in the mud. His bad shoulder gave a sharp, deep pull that ran down into his ribs, and he felt the bar begin to slip from his hands. Felt 73 years of work crowd into one moment that he was about to lose. Then a younger pair of hands closed over his on the bar. Not Travis. Glenn. His son on his knees in the river bottom, in a city slicker, his face inches from his father's, water running off both their chins. "I have got it," Glenn said. "Tell me where, tell me how." Wendell looked at the boy who had spent 20 years calling this place a grave and who was now holding the same iron his grandfather had held. And something broke loose in the old man's chest that had nothing to do with the storm. For 1 second in the white swing of the floodlights, Wendell was 40 years old again and kneeling beside his own father in another flood, with another set of younger hands being set upon the coal bar, and the whole long chain of it ran through him at once. Otis to Wendell, to Glenn, 4 generations bent over the same buried stones in the same black water. The men who had laughed were warm in their houses. The men who believed were here in the mud. There, Wendell said, under the plug, we pushed together. On 3. They pushed. The plug shifted, and from somewhere under the ground came a deep sucking sound that stopped every man where he stood. Then the old run took its first breath in 42 years. The water dropped as though the earth had opened a throat. The pool around their boots began to spin, darken, and pull hard toward the stone channel, dragging mud and corn stubble and broken pieces of clay down into the dark. 30 yards away, the boiling tile line eased. The split in the field still poured, but now it had somewhere to send what it poured, and the somewhere was not Hazel Crew's barn. No one laughed. Not Garrett Pruitt, who had arrived in his good shoes and stood speechless under a useless umbrella by the road. Not Curtis Lemon, alone now by his Oldsmobile, watching the easement he had buried come back to life in front of a sheriff and a reporter. Not Marvin Tilley, who kept saying this should not be happening, though it plainly was. Wendell wiped the rain from his eyes and looked toward the trapped cattle. Cut the lower fence, he said. Now, move them to the rise before the bank shears off. This time Royce did not argue. He ran for the pliers himself. But the wire would not cut. The rain had packed it with mud and grass, and the staples had swollen tight in the new posts, and Royce fought the pliers with both hands, slipping once, cursing once, then going dead silent when the calf bawled again from the dark. Wendell swung his flashlight across the lower corner. Not there, he called. Cut the second brace. You open the low side, they run straight into the break. Royce looked back, soaked and wild-eyed, a man who had spent his whole life being the one who gave the orders. And for the first time since he had signed his name at the courthouse, he did exactly what the old man told him. He moved to the second brace and cut, and the wire snapped loose, and Travis and a fireman swung the panel wide. The cattle came through, not in a clean line the way men picture it from a distance, but in a frightened black mass of horns and shoulders and steam churning the mud. A heifer went down on her knees in the gap. Hazel's nephew grabbed her tail and hauled. Wendell stepped in close and slapped her flank with his open hand and shouted her up, and she lurched forward just as the bank behind her folded into the water, with a sound like wet canvas tearing a strip of ground 8 feet wide, simply gone. The men stumbled back. The heifer bolted for the high ground. Royce stood frozen, and Wendell saw him understand that if they had cut the low side half, the herd would have gone down with that bank. Then Travis yelled from the draw, "Calf in the wire!" Wendell went first. He should not have been able to move that fast at 73, but fear and purpose can lend a body one last reserve. He slid down the bank, caught himself on a cedar root, and found the calf tangled in a sagging strand of wire where the current pushed hard against its side. Royce came down after him. Glenn came after Royce. "Hold the head up," Wendell said. And Royce Calloway, the man who had laughed at a ghost story in a warm courthouse 6 weeks before, dropped to his knees in the freezing mud and lifted the calf's head above the water with both arms. The animal kicked once, weak. Wendell cut the wire. Glenn and the nephew pulled, and the 3 of them dragged it up onto the rise, all of them breathing like they had run a mile uphill. Royce knelt there in the mud with his hands shaking, and he did not try to hide it. And Wendell, who had seen a great many men try to hide a great many things, said nothing at all. The calf got its legs under it after a minute and stood swaying on the rise, and its mother came out of the dark and pressed against it and would not be moved. And the 2 of them stood there in the rain alive. Royce watched them the way a man watches something he had nearly thrown away by his own hand. Then he got to his feet slow and he looked back across the field at the bright, crooked shape of his machinery shed sinking into the mud, and he looked at the running stones, and he did not say a word about either one. There were no words in him yet for what he was learning. There would be later in a courthouse basement in front of the whole county, but not yet. For now there was only the rain and the alive calf and an old man beside him who had been right all along and took no pleasure in it. By 2 in the morning the rain had eased to a hard, steady fall. By 3 the river was still rising, but the worst of the pressure had moved into the old run. Hazel Cruz had water around her steps, but not inside her door. Wendell's Barn Road had washed at the edges but held. County Road 18 had lost gravel but kept its culvert. The land had taken the road it had always taken, and the road had been enough. It was not a victory. Nothing that costs a man his cattle and his ground and his certainty is ever a victory. But it was survival, and out here survival was the only thing anybody had ever honestly been able to promise. The Calloway field was another matter. First light showed it as something clawed open from beneath. The smooth ground was cut through with brown channels. The filled wash had reappeared not as the gentle scar it had been, but as a raw, open wound running the length of the bottom. 46 acres lay under silt and standing water. One pivot tower leaned drunk against the gray sky. The gravel road was gone in 2 places. The machinery shed sat crooked on its crack pad doors, bowed outward, one corner sunk a full foot into the mud, the new mower inside half buried and still wearing its dealer paint. Men stood in the gray morning without talking. The same men who had laughed in the cafe. The same men who had called the hedge brush and the creek dead and the notebook a rain diary. Mud has a way of taking the shine off a man's certainty. Frank Dolan, the field manager who had told Wendell the ground was not smarter than the men who measured it, stood at the edge of the wound with his hard hat in his hand and did not put it back on. He did not come over to the old man. He did not say anything at all. He just stared at the place where his straight lines and his laser level and his soil tests had been, and where now there was only a brown channel cut clean through everything he had built. And after a while he walked to his truck and drove away and did not come back to the project, and no one sent for him. Royce walked to Wendell near the running stones. His raincoat was torn at the sleeve. His polished boots were finished for good. There was dried mud on his face and a shallow cut across the back of one hand. "How did you know where to open it?" he said. Wendell looked down at the water still pulling through the channel. "My grandfather opened it in 27. My father in 43 and again in 51. I kept it clear all these years because they told me to." Royce swallowed. "I thought it was just a ditch." "It was," Wendell said. "That is why it mattered." 2 days later, the county engineer drove down from Jefferson City. His name was Raymond Kessler, and he came with rolled maps and measuring rods and the patient expression of an educated man preparing to explain a disaster to the people who had survived it. Wendell met him at the kitchen table with the leather notebook, the easement copy, and 4 pages of fresh pencil notes from the storm. At first, Kessler handled the old book gently, the way a man handles another man's family Bible. Then he began carrying it out to the field and laying its pencil lines against what the water had done. The mule crossing matched, the spring pocket matched, the clay mouth matched, and the place where the machinery shed had sunk sat within 20 feet of a note Silas Stroud had penciled in 1927. "Ground sounds hollow after warm river rain." By noon, Raymond Kessler had stopped smiling. By 3, he was asking Wendell carefully whether he might photograph the pages for the county record. "There is a generation of men engineer said half to himself, standing at the lip of the running stones with the old book open in his hands, who learned this country one flood at a time and wrote it down in pencil because that was all they had. He looked at Wendell. We built a whole profession on the idea that we replaced them. He shut the book gently. We did not replace them. We just stopped reading what they left. Wendell did not answer. There was nothing in it to argue with, and a man who finally tells the truth deserves to hear it land in silence. That evening, Nora Vance came to the house. She did not bring a notebook. She brought the photographs she had taken 6 weeks before the ones of the brown paper map and the the unbroken field, and she laid them on the table beside Wendell's own pictures of the wound the storm had cut, and the two sets matched line for line. She looked at the old man across the table for a long moment. "You told me to keep the proof while it was cheap," she said. Her voice was not brisk anymore. "I almost did not. The story runs Thursday, front page, and it is getting to say that a 100-year-old notebook warned this county 58 years before it happened, and that the men who were paid to listen did not." Wendell only nodded. He had not wanted a story, but he understood the way his grandfather had understood that a warning nobody repeats is a warning that dies and dies useless. The county meeting was held 8 days after the storm in the basement of the Tuscumbia courthouse, a room of cinder block walls and folding chairs, and a coffee urn that scorched everything poured into it. Farmers came in from both sides of the river. Some came because their culverts had washed out. Some came to hear how much of Calloway's land was ruined. A few came because shame is easier to carry into a room when everyone agrees to call it curiosity. Royce sat in the second row with his hands folded and his eyes down, and he no longer looked like a man who had bought 640 acres. He looked like a man who had finally learned that owning ground and understanding it were two different things. Marvin Tilley stood at the front with a yellow legal pad. "What we experienced," he began, "was an unusual hydrological event involving heavy rainfall, a river backflow, and unforeseen subsurface behavior." Hazel Cruz stood up before he finished. She was 5 feet tall and 66 years old and had buried 2 husbands without once raising her voice above church volume, but the whole basement heard her. "It was foreseen," she said, "just not by the men who were paid to see it." No one laughed. Tilley looked at his shoes. Then Curtis Lemon rose smooth in a dry suit and tried to take the room back. "This was a catastrophic act of nature," he said. "No reasonable party could have predicted the magnitude. The bank acted in good faith on professional engineering. Any suggestion otherwise is." The bank was warned. It was Garrett Pruitt who said it from his chair, not standing, his eyes on the table. The room turned, with the front page of the ledger sitting in every other lap and the county engineer's report already filed. Pruitt had done the arithmetic a banker always does in the end and decided which loss was survivable. "Mr. Stroud came to my office," he said. "He brought the recorded easement. He told me what would happen. I told him we could not pause the project." He looked up finally at Lemon. "We were warned. It is in no one's interest to pretend otherwise." Curtis Lemon stood alone in the middle of the room with no one's eyes on him but his own partner's, and Royce Calloway's eyes held nothing for him at all. Then Royce stood. For one moment, Wendell thought he might do what men like him always did: blame the contractor, the engineer, the storm, the records, anyone. Instead, Royce turned to face the room. "I was warned," he said. "It was not loud, it was clear. I was warned at the courthouse. I was warned at my own fence. I was warned in front of most of you at a field day I held to show off ground I did not understand." He looked at Wendell, and this time there was nothing performed in it, and I laughed. Nobody moved. "I cut what I did not understand," Royce said. "I filled what I thought was useless. A calf nearly drowned in front of me, and I had to be told by a 73-year-old man which fence to cut to save it. He stopped. I was wrong. That was all. But in a town like Tuscumbia, where a man could talk for 40 minutes and never admit a single thing, it landed like a confession in a church. When Royce sat down, the basement stayed quiet for a long moment, and then from the back, Harold Dunbar stood up. He turned his hat in his hands the way he had turned it at the field day. I laughed too, he said, to no one in particular, and to everyone. At the cafe, I called it a jungle. He looked at Wendell across the rows of folding chairs. I have known this man 40 years, and I let a fellow from out of county tell me what he was worth. He sat back down as abruptly as he had stood, his ears red, and it was not much, but it was the first time in Wendell's memory that a Miller County man had stood up in a public room and called himself a fool on purpose. Cleve Hartman's, a seed dealer, did not stand. But he did not meet anyone's eye either, and when the meeting broke up, he left by the side door without his usual joke, and that the cafe agreed later was as close to an apology as Cleve Hartman had in him. The county ordered the relief easement permanently restored and protected. The bank froze the second phase of the development note. Insurance covered some of the machinery, but not the grading, not the buried drainage, not the failed fill. And Curtis Lemon pulled his money out within the month and was not seen in Miller County again. Royce sold one pivot tower before it ever turned a single circle. He sold the disc ripper at a loss. The great Callaway River Bottom project became smaller, rougher, and far more expensive than the man had ever imagined when he signed his name in the room that smelled of floor wax and old paper. But the strangest thing, the thing the cafe could not stop turning over, was what Royce Calloway did next. By July, the old scar was open again, crooked and raw, marked with straw bales and survey flags and fresh stone. And along the gone north line, two men worked in the heat replanting a hedge. Osage orange, willow, cedar, wild plum. One of them old and slow, favoring a shoulder that had never come right since the storm. The other quiet and blistered, learning to dig a hole the way it ought to be dug. Royce paid Wendell for the consultation. Wendell took only half. "You will need the rest for trees," he said. Royce did not argue. That was how the county first knew the man had truly changed. Not all at once. Men like Royce Calloway did not turn humble in a single season. He still wore good shirts and spoke too fast in meetings and wanted clean numbers on clean paper. But he stopped calling rough ground wasted. He stopped saying Dead Creek. And whenever the rain came hard out of the west, he drove to the field himself and watched the stone run before he ever looked at his corn. Glenn stayed through the summer. He took a leave from the job in Kansas City, and then he took a longer one, and Diane brought the children down for August. And for the first time since Maybelle died, there were young voices in the Stroud house again. One evening, Wendell found his son at the kitchen table with the leather notebook open under the lamp, copying his grandfather's lines into a fresh tablet in his own hand. So there would be two of them, he said, in case one was ever lost. Wendell stood in the doorway and did not let the boy see his face. "You used to call this book a waste," Wendell said when he could trust his voice. "I called a lot of things a waste," Glenn said, not looking up from the page. "I was wrong about most of them." He kept writing the pencil, moving slow and careful over the names of places his great-great-grandfather had walked. "The grandkids ought to be able to read it," he said. "Not just keep it in a drawer. A thing nobody can read is just a thing waiting to be thrown out." Wendell came and sat down across from his son, and for a while the only sound in the kitchen was the pencil and the moths against the window screen, and it was, he thought, the finest evening he had spent in that house in 5 years. In October of 1986, Wendell invited the local agriculture class out to the place. 21 teenagers climbed off a yellow school bus with notebooks and rubber boots and the half-bored faces of kids who had been promised a farm and expected a ditch. He led them past the leaning barn down the lower road through the young hedge that stood only waist-high now, but had taken root and held. Royce came to and stood back by the fence with his hands in his jacket pockets and let the old man talk. Wendell showed them the flood line penciled on the barn post. He showed them where the water had dropped when the cedar plug came loose. He passed the leather notebook down the row and made each student hold it with both hands. A boy in a blue corduroy jacket raised his hand. "Mr. Stroud, how did you know the water would come back?" Wendell looked out across the field. The restored channel caught the low October light in a thin silver line, and the young hedge trembled in the wind. And beyond it, Royce's corn stood shorter than the man had hoped, but greener and healthier than anyone in the county had expected. "I did not know more than anybody else," Wendell said. "I just believed the people who watched before me." The boy wrote it down. Wendell saw the small pencil move across the paper, and for a reason he could not have explained to a single soul in that field, it very nearly broke his heart. That evening, after the bus had gone and Royce had driven home, and Glenn was inside setting the table, Wendell closed the barn alone. He paused at the post and laid 2 fingers against Maybelle's penciled line, the way a man touches a thing to be sure it is still real. The air smelled of dry leaves and cattle and river mud. Not danger now, only memory. He thought of the boy in the blue corduroy jacket writing down a sentence he would not understand for 30 more years, the way Wendell had not understood his own father at the mule crossing until he was an old man himself. That was how it went. You set the words down for someone who could not yet read them, and you trusted that the year would come when they could. His grandfather had done it. His father had done it. He had spent a lifetime believing it was enough, and tonight, for the first time, he knew it was. On the seat of the Ford, the notebook lay wrapped again in oilcloth, and beside it lay the second copy, the one in his son's hand. Wendell started the truck and sat a moment before he put it in gear. Across the fence, the new hedge was thin and fragile, and not much to look at in the failing light. But its roots were taking hold, and somewhere up at the house a window was lit, and there were people inside it waiting for him to come in out of the dark. Because some land does not need a richer owner. It needs someone patient enough to listen. And a warning does not save anybody at all unless there is somebody left who still believes it and somebody younger still willing to write it down.